Shiloh is a scam.
No one in 40 years have had me on this pulpit talk any ought against any ministry.
Tonight we examine a public clash that has captured headlines, stirred emotions, and forced an urgent conversation in the Christian community. Pastor Sunday Adelaja, a well-known voice in African Christianity who has often critiqued prosperity teaching and megachurch culture, has called Shiloh, the annual prophetic gathering of Living Faith Church, a scam. The remark is blunt and shocking. Bishop David Oyedepo, the founder and spiritual architect behind Shiloh and the Living Faith movement, answered decisively, defending the gathering as God-ordained and life-changing. This is not simply a disagreement between two men. It is a debate about theology and method, about stewardship and spectacle, about pastoral care and institutional scale. It asks hard questions. When a religious event grows to global proportions, who benefits? How should leaders balance prophetic boldness with pastoral sensitivity? And when money and expectation are combined, how do we protect the vulnerable? Over the next segment we will do three things. First, restate the headline and explain why the charge matters. Second, unpack Pastor Adelaja's accusation in detail and the motives behind it. Third, describe what Shiloh actually is, its history, structure, theology, and why so many people experience it as spiritually powerful. This conversation matters because millions have been impacted by Shiloh, many with testimonies they believe are genuine encounters with God. At the same time, responsible leaders and observers have long warned about the potential for exploitation in large gatherings. We must hold both realities in tension, the lived testimony of the faithful and the pastoral duty to protect and steward well. Let's begin with the accusation itself, the nature of the critique and why it has resonated so widely. Adelaja's accusation: Shiloh is a scam. To call something a scam is to accuse it of deception and exploitation. For a leader like Pastor Sunday Adelaja to make such a charge carries weight because he is not a casual commentator, he is an established voice with a consistent critique of certain ministry trends. So let's unpack what he means, and why many people took notice. Adelaja's critique rests on three interrelated concerns: economic extraction, spectacle and marketing, and pastoral vulnerability. Each deserves careful attention. Economic extraction. Adelaja argues that when a program couples intense spiritual promises with layered fundraising mechanisms, the result can be an industry that extracts wealth from attendees. Examples critics point to include premium or tiered access packages and travel bundles promoted alongside the event, highly staged special offering moments with emotional appeals and testimony boxes, merchandise and branded items sold as part of the Shiloh experience, visible, repeated calls to fund large building projects or institutional expansions. The worry is not simply that money moves, every organization requires resources, but that the spiritual urgency of the occasion makes people feel pressured to give beyond their means. When the spiritual language implies guaranteed breakthrough tied to giving, vulnerable people may make choices that harm families. That is Adelaja's pastoral alarm. B. Spectacle, branding and marketing. Mega events today look like global productions, high-quality audio-visuals, theatrical lighting, carefully curated stages, and media teams. Critics say that such production can shift attention from worship to spectacle. Shiloh, by virtue of its scale, is inevitably subject to these dynamics. Adelaja warns that when the event feels like a branded product, the spiritual center can be displaced by marketing priorities. This is a subtle but important point. A program can be both spiritually earnest and professionally produced. The question is whether the production becomes a substitute for genuine pastoral care and spiritual integrity. C. Pastoral vulnerability and ethical concern. Most deeply, Adelaja frames his argument as a protective plea. He highlights the risk to ordinary, often poor, believers who invest sacrificially based on powerful promises. His contention is, when leaders promise miraculous outcomes and simultaneously solicit large offerings, without clear accountability, the result can be pastoral harm. This is not merely an economic critique, it is an ethical, pastoral one. Who bears responsibility when promises are perceived as binding? Who cares for the disappointed? Those pastoral questions are at the heart of Adelaja's alarm. Why this charge is explosive? Two reasons explain the sharp reaction. First, prestige. Bishop Oyedepo and Living Faith are major institutions. Labeling their flagship event a scam is an attack on a movement, not just a sermon. Second, testimony. Millions testify to life-changing moments at Shiloh. To dismiss the event as a scam is perceived by many as negating those testimonies. The result is intense polarization, defenders who point to fruit and critics who demand accountability. Adelaja's intervention is, in essence, a call for reform and oversight. Whether you agree with the language or not, his statement forced a public conversation about stewardship, messaging, and the pastoral risks of large events. That conversation is necessary, even painful. The way the church handles it will determine whether trust is deepened or eroded. What Shiloh represents in living faith. To weigh any accusation fairly, we must first understand what Shiloh is, why it matters to millions, and how living faith presents the gathering. A historical and spiritual identity. Shiloh is the signature annual gathering of Living Faith Church, a concentrated season of prayer, prophetic ministry, teaching, and testimony that the movement describes as a prophetic appointment. Organizers often cite the biblical Shiloh, the place of assembly in Joshua, and the Old Testament practice of yearly pilgrimages in 1 Samuel 1 verse 3, to frame the event as a spiritual pattern rather than a mere program. B. Programming and structure. Shiloh is intense by design. Extended prayer hours, impartation services, prophetic ministrations, business and leadership workshops, youth streams, and large testimony sessions. The structure creates a sustained spiritual atmosphere. For many attendees, the cumulative effect is transformative. C. Testimonies and institutional output. Countless personal testimonies are associated with Shiloh, stories of healings, reconciliations, job restorations, and supernatural provision. These testimonies are a primary reason people return. Additionally, Living Faith points to long-term projects, Covenant University, outreach programs, health initiatives, as evidence that resources mobilized by the movement fund tangible social goods. Supporters argue these outcomes counter the scam narrative. D. Economic reality and the duty of stewardship. Large gatherings require budgets, venue upkeep, media production, security, staffing, and mission funding. That reality does not automatically mean exploitation. It does mean transparency matters. Where institutions are open about how funds are used, critics have less ground. Where communication is opaque, suspicion grows. E. The theological lens for adherence. For adherents, Shiloh is not transactional, it is covenantal. The language of breakthrough, mandate, and prophetic timing shapes how attendees interpret experiences. Calling the event a scam therefore challenges not only an event but a theological framework, and that is why reactions are so charged. In short, Shiloh is simultaneously a spiritual season with genuine testimonies and an organizational enterprise with economic realities. Those two truths coexist, and it is precisely their intersection that must be stewarded with wisdom. Adelaja's critique asks us to safeguard the pastoral element of that stewardship. Shiloh's defenders invite us to remember the spiritual fruit and the institutions that serve people beyond the event. Bishop Oyedepo's response. When the charge of scam was leveled against Shiloh, Bishop David Oyedepo did not stay silent. His response was clear, direct, and deeply rooted in his theology and ministry history. First, Oyedepo defended Shiloh as God-ordained, not man-made. He reminded his listeners that Shiloh was birthed not out of a boardroom decision or a marketing strategy, but through what he described as a divine encounter. Since 1999, he has consistently presented Shiloh as a prophetic appointment, a covenant platform where God speaks direction for the year ahead. For Oyedepo, this foundation makes the word scam not just insulting, but spiritually misguided. Second, Oyedepo emphasized the sheer volume of testimonies. Year after year, thousands of people line up to share stories of healings, deliverances from addiction, marital breakthroughs, supernatural financial upliftment, and miraculous turnarounds in their careers and families. These stories are not just anecdotal in his view, they are proof that God himself validates Shiloh. To dismiss the entire event as exploitation, he argues, is to dismiss the lived experiences of millions who claim to have encountered God at Shiloh. Third, Oyedepo categorically rejected the scam label. He pointed to the global impact of Living Faith's ministries, universities like Covenant and Landmark, hospitals, outreach programs, and church plants in over 100 nations. His position is simple: an institution producing such fruit cannot be called a scam. If anything, he presents Living Faith as a model of what divine empowerment can accomplish when God blesses his people. Finally, Oyedepo defended the doctrine of prosperity itself. In his teaching, prosperity is not exploitation but covenant truth. He cites scriptures such as Deuteronomy 8 verse 18, "It is God who gives you power to get wealth," and 3 John 1 verse 2, "I wish above all things that you prosper and be in health." To him, prosperity is God's will for his people, but it is tied to obedience, service, and covenant practices like giving. In his view, offerings are not about enriching pastors, They are spiritual seeds that produce tangible harvests for believers who give in faith. The clash of theologies. This exchange is not just about Shiloh. It reveals a deeper and long-standing theological clash within global Christianity. On one side is Pastor Sunday Adelaja's critique. He argues that what is often called the prosperity gospel amounts to manipulation. In his analysis, preachers promise supernatural wealth in exchange for financial offerings, but in practice, the cycle benefits church leadership far more than struggling congregants. For Adelaja, tying breakthrough to giving distorts the gospel of grace into a transaction, and the poor end up carrying the burden. On the other side stands Bishop David Oyedepo's conviction. He insists prosperity is not manipulation but revelation. He describes it as a covenant system in which God blesses those who obey His word, honor Him with their resources, and live faithfully. In his theology, financial prosperity is no different from healing or deliverance. It is part of the package of redemption purchased by Christ. To deny prosperity, he argues, is to deny part of God's covenant with His people. This clash represents two lenses on the same Bible. Adelaja stresses caution, stewardship, and transparency. Oyedepo stresses faith, obedience, and covenant practice. Both agree Christians must live responsibly, but they diverge on whether large-scale financial mobilization in events like Shiloh is an act of faith or potential abuse of trust. More broadly, this debate echoes in churches worldwide. Should faith always be accompanied by financial accountability? Where is the line between faith declarations and irresponsible promises? And can prosperity teaching uplift communities without sliding into materialism? These are not questions for Nigeria alone. They are global questions facing the 21st century church. Public reactions. The clash between Adelaja and Oyedepo has ignited a storm of public reactions, both online and offline. For supporters of Bishop Oyedepo, the accusations are baseless and even dangerous. They see Shiloh as a prophetic mandate with undeniable fruit. To them, Adelaja's comments are not simply criticism of a program, but an attack on God's work itself. These supporters flood testimonies online, citing personal healings, financial turnarounds, and answered prayers as proof that Shiloh is genuine. For followers of Adelaja, the controversy is confirmation of what they have long suspected, that megachurch programs can easily become financial machines. They applaud Adelaja's boldness, framing him as a whistleblower willing to say what many others fear to say. They argue that if the church does not reform, critics outside the faith will keep dismissing Christianity as exploitation. And then there are the neutral voices. These include theologians, journalists, and ordinary believers who do not question the sincerity of worshippers at Shiloh but still raise concerns about accountability. They acknowledge that Shiloh has impacted millions but insist that impact does not eliminate the need for transparency. Their position is, fruit should be celebrated, but stewardship must be scrutinized. In the end, the public reaction shows us a divided field. One group celebrates Shiloh as a divine visitation, another condemns it as a manipulative scheme, and a third urges reform without rejection. What is clear is that the debate has struck a nerve, forcing the church, once again, to grapple with prosperity, prophecy, and pastoral responsibility in a globalized age. This is more than a clash of personalities. It is a mirror held up to the church. It challenges leaders to steward faith responsibly, it challenges believers to test every word carefully, and it challenges all of us to distinguish between manipulation and revelation. Whether you stand with Bishop Oyedepo, align with Adelaja, or remain somewhere in the middle, the conversation itself is shaping the future of faith communities in Africa and beyond. The bigger questions. As the dust settles on this clash between Pastor Sunday Adelaja and Bishop David Oyedepo, the controversy leaves us with bigger questions. Questions that go beyond personalities, beyond Shiloh itself, and strike at the heart of modern Christianity. The first is this: should church gatherings like Shiloh be judged by finances, or by spiritual outcomes? For critics, the focus on offerings, seed sowing, and financial pledges overshadows the genuine spiritual pursuit. They ask, if a gathering produces more financial turnover than discipleship depth, has it truly served the kingdom? But supporters counter, finances are simply the tool, not the focus. They argue that the fruit, transformed lives, answered prayers, restored families, and global missionary impact, must be the primary yardstick. In their eyes, the billions spent or raised are secondary compared to the eternal value of souls saved and destinies redirected. The second question is prosperity teaching a biblical truth, or a modern distortion? For centuries, the church has debated how to balance material blessing with spiritual devotion. Scriptures like Proverbs 10 verse 22 declare, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich and adds no sorrow." Yet other scriptures like Matthew 6 verse 19 caution against laying up treasures on earth. So, where does the balance lie? For prosperity preachers like Oyedepo, the message is clear. Wealth is part of God's covenant blessing, intended to advance His kingdom and uplift His people. But for critics like Adelaja, that interpretation risks turning faith into a financial formula, one that may leave vulnerable believers disillusioned when promised breakthroughs don't arrive. The third and perhaps most piercing question is this: do attacks like these strengthen or weaken the faith of believers? For some, Adelaja's bold words shake confidence. They wonder, have I been manipulated all these years? Questions that once simmered quietly now bubble to the surface. For others, however, such attacks deepen resolve. They feel persecution only proves that their gathering is authentic, that God's work will always attract opposition. And for a middle ground of believers, the controversy sparks healthy self-examination. Am I attending Shiloh just for miracles, or for a deeper relationship with God? These questions do not have easy answers. But they matter, because how the church responds will shape not only the future of Shiloh, but the credibility of Christianity in a skeptical world. So where does this leave us? At its core, the clash between Pastor Sunday Adelaja and Bishop David Oyedepo has exposed deep divides within modern Christianity. One side emphasizes caution, accountability, and the dangers of financial manipulation. The other stresses faith, covenant obedience, and the undeniable fruit of global impact. And yet, despite the criticism, Shiloh continues. Year after year, millions gather in OTA, Nigeria, and millions more tune in across the globe. Whatever position one takes, Shiloh 2025 is already on the horizon, with worshippers preparing their hearts and critics sharpening their questions. The real issue is not whether Shiloh will happen, it will. The issue is what believers make of it. Will they approach it as a divine encounter, or dismiss it as a cleverly orchestrated event? And so, the call comes back to you, the listener: scam or spiritual encounter? That is the question. Discern for yourself. Weigh the fruits. Test the teachings. And above all, seek the God who is bigger than every preacher, every program, and every controversy. Because in the end, whether it is Adelaja's voice or Oyedepo's response, the final word must always belong to Christ, the author and finisher of our faith.